for your information. So over to you, Mark.
Well, thank you very much, Marcus. And hopefully you can see my slides. So I'll just go into presentation mode.
Yep, we see your slides, but
thank
now
you
it's
very
in
much.
presentation mode. Great.
Cheers. So today I'll be taking you through some of the key findings of our annual Global Threat Intelligence report. And this is a report that we put together every year, and it's actually the 10th year that we've been doing these reports. And I'll be distilling the 5 key trends that we've distilled based on the data that we've analysed this year. So thank you all for joining. Analysis of our report is based on logs, events, attacks, actual real-world security incidents that are detected by our Security Operations Center. They monitor our clients' infrastructure. Our focus is looking at threats that are targeting their assets, right? Their infrastructure, their data. As we put together this report, we also have access to NTT's global internet backbone telemetry that provides us with additional visibility into attacks and who they're targeting, and we can help understand some of the nature of the threat landscapes that we see. We also maintain a global network of honeypot sensors that we look at to see who's targeting, what applications they're targeting, what tools that the threat actor may be leaving behind. And all of that intelligence is collected by our Global Threat Intelligence Center, which I lead. We also have contributions from NTT CERT in Japan as well, who analyze threats based on threats targeting NTT's own infrastructure. So the purpose of producing this report is having a look how the threat landscape is changing over time. It helps us understand what the impact is to not only our own infrastructure, but that of our clients, and understanding what we can be doing to enhance our clients' security posture. So obviously, the threat landscape evolves every year, right? It's constantly challenging the status quo. We've also seen a lot of transformation right across different industries and certainly our clients. But more broadly, we've also seen a very uncertain geopolitical environment emerge over the past 12 to 18 months. So in terms of the 5 key findings that we'll talk about today, you can see them here. So firstly, attackers are refocusing their targeting towards critical infrastructure. And we'll get into some of the details behind each of these trends a bit later on. But we've seen different sectors that have been targeted globally, not only because of COVID-19. We've seen the geopolitical tensions more recently, supply chain disruptions. Secondly, we've seen this migration to the cloud, and migrating to the cloud means that the attacks targeting those applications and data has also changed. Thirdly, we talk about the diversifying scope and intensity of attacks. Here, we'll talk about how attackers are branching out into more industries, experiencing higher volumes of activity than previous years. Fourth, we're seeing Trojan deployments soar. So there's certainly more Trojans and botnets increasing, whilst we're also seeing reductions in certain types of malware, cryptocurrency miners as an example of that. And lastly, ransomware prevalence, whereby organizations are facing challenges in defending and responding to ransomware incidents. So let's kick off into the first key trend. Obviously, one of the outcomes from geopolitical conflict, COVID-19, and the ongoing supply chain issues, that has resulted in disruption across many different industries, right? We've seen fluctuations in not only the types of malicious activity, but also the volume of activity, as well as the industries that are now most targeted. As an example, we've seen attacks have more than doubled in both the telco space, as well as transport and distribution sector. Transport and distribution it appeared in the top 5 most targeted sectors. That was certainly new for us. We hadn't seen that before. And you think just what's happened over the past 2 years or so, there has been increased reliance on global supply chains and logistics. Also increased virtualization of business processes, the shift to working from anywhere, and also changing consumer behavior as well. So you think about going back to 2021, everyone was remotely working. They were purchasing goods online and probably more frequently than they have been in the past. And the essential nature of the vaccine cold chain, upon which transport and logistics is really an integral part of. So getting a product from point A to point B involves the transportation and logistics sector. So those drivers place greater demand on both network and communication systems like routers, edge devices, infrastructure, and cloud applications. And I think it also explains why we're seeing governance and industry bodies call for more safeguards into protecting critical infrastructure. In some cases, for example, this has meant redefining what it means to be a custodian of critical infrastructure or a system of national importance. But clearly, the world is increasingly connected, and therefore organizations have to be doing more to protect society, critical infrastructure, and the supply chain to preserve our way of life. Second major trend that we see here is the type of assets that are being targeted. So over the past few years, organizations have shifted more of their workloads to the cloud and web-based environments in general, but that has given rise to more attacks targeting those web applications. I think in general, cloud providers have done a solid job in protecting their infrastructure and platforms, but application and data supporting those applications tends to be under the control of end users or clients. Most businesses these days have a web presence, and that is really the footprint, which is now actively targeted by would-be attackers. So looking at things like misconfigurations, vulnerabilities, credential leaks. So based on our analysis, what we're seeing is about 72% of all attacks are now directed towards web and applications. And we're seeing that trend continuing to rise each year. So for example, if you look at 2018, that was only about 32%. But as you go up every year, it goes, the attacks or the volume of those attacks is increasing. We've also observed attackers expanding their scope and intensity. So we saw about 30% increase in hostile activity targeting clients. And again, this was led by attacks targeting applications and network infrastructure. But we're also seeing denial of service as well as credential brute force as well. Attack volumes increased for about 7 of the top 10 most targeted industries, with, of course, web application attacks and application-specific attacks up in most of those industries and in nearly every region that we analyzed. Now, the proportion of attacks targeting those top 3 industries actually declined. So what that actually means is that more industries are now experiencing higher levels of activity. It also indicates that attacks are moving on to lower hanging fruit. It's not just about targeting those top 3 sectors. So what we're seeing is that attackers are now targeting those less secure organizations and those that they've traditionally targeted. So all industries are effectively fair game. We also had a look at vulnerabilities, and in 2021, we saw the greatest number of newly discovered vulnerabilities compared to any previous year. And that was at about 22,000, slightly under, whereby a vulnerability was discovered every 24 minutes on average. So it's kind of against this complex and challenging backdrop in which businesses and security leaders have to navigate. In terms of Trojan deployments, of course, we're seeing these increase as well. I think anyone who's involved in operations can attest to that. But again, we're seeing botnets resurface. We've seen increased use of banking Trojans, which demonstrates a rise in cybercriminal activity, and that's often motivated by financial gain. Whilst increased deployment of the likes of remote access Trojans suggests a rise in corporate espionage and theft of intellectual property and trade secrets. That tends to suggest or a desire to maintain control of victims longer term. It's not necessarily about smash and grab attacks, but we're seeing more activity that involves malware with the intention to maintain persistence. So, for example, Trojans accounted for about 65% of all malware detections in every industry that we analyze, excluding the education sector. But that has been up from 35% the previous year. And as I mentioned before, cryptocurrency miners have actually decreased now. That's down to 6%, which was only a year prior to that, up to around 41%. And that tends to correlate with the price of cryptocurrency assets, where over the past 12 months or so, the price of cryptocurrency has actually dropped. In terms of the ransomware threat, almost 1 in 4 of our incident response engagements we were involved with were related to ransomware. That's a 240% growth from levels in 2019, obviously a significant increase there. But such activity indicates that organizations are increasingly challenged in defending and responding to ransomware incidents. The industries who most frequently have called upon us to assist in those engagements was the retail sector, manufacturing, insurance, and of course, technology and healthcare was also not far behind. But I think there's no shortage of incidents in the news talking about the impact of ransomware on business. I certainly know that the number of malware families that we're monitoring now have increased, certainly over the past 6 months as well. In terms of the most common method attackers are using to infect organizations here, it tends to be via email containing malicious links or attachments. And we know that from our research that the average ransomware demand is going up, right? Payouts are going up, and therefore the total cost of ransomware for 2021 was actually expected to near around 20 billion US dollars. And I think as a result of that, we're also seeing more industry bodies and government agencies establish the likes of ransomware task force to enhance in information sharing and other types of collaboration initiatives in pursuit of disrupting ransomware actors. So next we'll go on to some of the global insights that we're seeing as well. So as you can see here, technology and finance experienced the majority of attacks that we saw, but where we've seen that biggest change is in that transport and distribution sector, which now comes at the number 5 most targeted industry. But regardless of the industry, region, or technology targeted, the volume of web applications and application-specific attacks has continued to increase annually. But as you can see here as well, we're also seeing denial of service and brute force activity, like credential brute force, is continuing to also take center stage. In most instances, attackers are not leveraging those zero-day exploits. They're looking for that easiest path to compromise an organization. Whilst you do have highly sophisticated adversaries like nation states, they may use zero-day exploits in their campaigns, but they do so infrequently. The preference is always to look for more simple attack vectors, the opportunistic attack. And that really explains why we continue to observe such a higher amount of brute force activity. It always continues to remain in the top 5 attacks that we see, because it's far easier to use brute force or password theft to log into internet accessible systems, be it remote desktop, VPNs, web portals, and so forth. On the left-hand side here, we can see the top industries targeted annually by year, and we've done this for the past 10 years now, as you can see, and it's color-coded based on the top malware threats we observe. So blue indicates Trojan, gray is information stealers, and this year reveals that, of course, technology and finance being the top, but with the manufacturing sector, we've seen that steadily increase over the past few years as well. And again, this is an industry that's undergoing a lot of transformation. Think about the connectedness of things, IoT, edge devices, robotic process automation, a lot of activities happening in that environment. And with a lot of new technologies being deployed or being integrated, of course, you're going to see more attacks targeted at that because the application attack surface is increasing. Education sector, again, it's something that we tend to see within the top five. At least for the last few years, we've been doing these reports. They tend to conduct research on behalf of governments and private industry. So they do store and process vast amounts of intellectual property, which is valuable to would-be attackers. And obviously gaining access to trademark secrets and key resources is something that's a great avenue for an attacker to target, because education sector tends not to have that same level of security that the likes of the financial sector does. Interestingly here, we see healthcare was a prime target during COVID in 2020 as part of the vaccine cold chain. However, that activity has really decreased over the past 12 months or so. Now, on the right-hand side, we see sectors and the most common malware we observe in those environments. Now, whilst ransomware disruption became one of the most significant threats to business continuity, it's actually Trojans and botnets which are dominating the malware landscape. So as you can see in the dark and light blue, again, we're seeing that common theme of Trojans, botnets really taking center stage here. So the occurrence of these types of malware demonstrates that attackers are seeking control, they're seeking persistence, whereby the intention is not necessarily to steal data. It could be to conduct further surveillance as well. And a lot of these types of malwares are multifunctional in nature. They're not just there to deploy payloads, download additional software, but they have multifunctional malware capabilities like taking screenshots, monitoring keyboard strokes, sending data to attacker-controlled infrastructure as well. But in terms of the overall malware activity that we saw last year, that has actually increased by nearly 50% from levels observed in 2020. And you'll also notice here that the presence of crypto mining activity in the education sector, that was the only one to see that in the top five types of malware. Whereby that's different to what we see from a regional perspective as well, and we'll touch on what that looks like in the next couple of slides. But the education sector, because it tends to be more open and I guess accessible, it's needed for collaboration purposes, right? Education sector has to be open for R&D purposes. Students are conducting mining operations. They're looking to generate passive incomes at the expense of the educational institution. So they'll go to universities, school environments, they'll plug in their laptops, which are used to mine cryptocurrency. And of course, that's where we are able to detect that type of activity. So this shift to cloud computing has fundamentally changed the way organizations and their web infrastructure is supported. In most cases, moving to the cloud means that the organization's biggest potential target for attackers are those external facing applications that they manage. The drivers being technology transformation, cloud migration, work from anywhere. Those types of trends have resulted in that ratio of attacks increase from 32% to 72%. And that's a significant rise and a trend that indicates that attackers are moving up the stack closer to where the application data is actually processed or stored. And it's not just the proportion of those attacks shifting to target web applications, but it's also the volume of activity here as well, which has increased about 30% from the previous year. In some industries, we're actually seeing a twofold increase in attacks, specifically the technology sector. But the key point here is that the volumes of activity increasing and vulnerabilities is also becoming more frequent. So when we look at vulnerabilities, we think about the weaponization of those vulnerabilities, and we don't have to look any further than Log4j, which most people, I'm sure, would be familiar with. It's an open source logging library. It was discovered, the vulnerability was discovered in mid-December of 2021. But that piece of code or that application was used by millions of computers worldwide running online services. So it requires very little expertise to exploit, making it actually one of the most severe vulnerabilities that we've seen in recent years. So within only a few hours of that vulnerability being reported, we started to see those in the wild exploit attempts already making their rounds across our client bases. Those organizations raced to patch their environment. Of course, they had to patch multiple times because new ways of exploiting that vulnerability had been discovered over the coming days. And it actually became the 8th most targeted technology for the entire year. Even though there was only 23 days left in the calendar, that's how proactive attackers were scanning and trying to exploit that particular vulnerability. So I think this type of vulnerability as well really highlights the importance of software supply chain and trust. Do we trust the software and the quality of the software that we use? Because only a small window of vulnerability creates a window of opportunity for attackers. So with the increased use of automated tools and cybercrime as a service models, this is really lowering the barrier for entry for attackers to actually be effective in targeting organizations. In terms of malware from a global perspective, URSNF was the most detected malware at 20%, followed by Ramnet. And for those who don't know, URSNF it's a very common banking Trojan. Again, it's multifunctional in nature. It steals credentials. It can take other types of information from your computer, computer and network details. And generally, attackers use URSNF to install additional malware components as well. Ramnet, on the other hand, was originally designed to be a virus. It then gained worm-like capabilities, but now it has also been upgraded to provide command and control capabilities as well. So again, we're kind of seeing that trend of malware becoming more multifunctional. That was certainly common in APAC region and Japan, but it was quite different to what we saw in Europe. We've also witnessed the resurgence of Emotet and TrickBot, two very well-known banking Trojans. Emotet, for example, was taken offline by a coordinated effort at the start of last year. That was conducted by Europol with various support from law enforcement and other judicial authorities. But that botnet actually resurfaced in November of 2021. And then it continued to provide malware as a service capabilities to cybercriminal groups who would then rent access to those compromised systems for further malware propagation. So what we were seeing is that Emotet was actually deploying TrickBot, and TrickBot was deploying QuackBot, and QuackBot was deploying Ryuk. So a lot of these banking Trojans work hand in hand with those payloads being deployed for access for other types of threat groups. So whilst many of these attacks followed global trends, there were some notable differences here. You can probably spot, Europe. That again was the only region to observe cryptocurrency miners in the top 10 malware detections, and it's the only region that did not have Trojans as the most commonly detected malware. So Europe in this case actually shows 3 cryptocurrency miners here. So Crypto Miner, Coin Mine, and XM Rig being the key standouts. And it was also the only region to observe detection of exploit kits in the top 10 malware. And an exploit kit being a tool used for automatically managing and deploying exploits against a target. So off the back of the COVID health crisis, ongoing geopolitical conflict, and this impact to supply chain, that really captured the attention of organizations and the minds of individuals. Those 2 major events had significant impact and still remain unresolved in the world today. So what our team did was have a look at some of the activity happening between the Russia and Ukraine conflict. And specifically, we were looking at whether or not there was potential spillover for attacks to impact other countries. Like COVID-19 did on the cybersecurity domain, the Russian invasion will also have this lasting impact on cyber. So effectively what happened was the physical invasion began late February 2022, but the actual cyber operations began earlier than that. And that conflict has brought obviously, economic sanctions, physical and cyber operations targeting critical infrastructure, financial institutions, oil, gas, etc. But businesses and other types of industries along that supply chain have also been impacted by that now. So initially what we saw was a series of operations using data wiping malware that targeted multiple industries in Ukraine, governments, non-profit, technology companies. And the goal of that was really about sabotage, wiping critical data or rendering systems inoperable. But actually, a month prior to that physical invasion, in January 2022, attackers defaced about 50 Ukrainian government websites. In February, we started to see those DDoS attacks target Ukraine armed forces, national banks, and they were crippled services for hours. But what I think this shows that we're seeing this full range of cyber attacks employed to support conflict. And as you can see here, we've put together some of the types of attacks that we observed. So everything from credential compromise, data theft, DDoS, phishing, ransomware, disinformation campaigns, the whole gamut of attack categories have been employed to support the actual physical war. So I think this is it's a divergence or change in activity compared to previous wars. It really plays that hybrid role between cyber and physical. So I think it goes to support that all's fair in love and war. The diversity of attacks employed during conflict will continue to expand over time here. Specifically with the conflict, we have been tracking a group called Gamma Redden, which is an APT group. It's also called Primitive Bear, Actinium, just depending which vendor you ask. They've been targeting Ukraine government agencies for many years. And in fact, the first known activities from this group were around 2013. They tend to conduct espionage operations. Recently, we've seen Security Service of Ukraine publicly attribute this to 5 Russian Federal Security Service officers who are based in Crimea. But this group tends to use spear phishing, malicious office file attachments to compromise their targets. What we did using our unique internet backbone telemetry was identify some of the attacker-controlled infrastructure, and multiple compromises were identified across not only Ukraine during the early weeks of the conflict, but we also saw this communication to other victims operating within the European nexus as well. So therefore, we could confirm that there was spillover into other NATO countries. So effectively, that visibility, using our internet backbone to support our intelligence collection, that allows us to automatically detect those changes to adversarial infrastructure, which we then can propagate as a blacklist to support our threat detection platform. So that really supports our ability to detect and respond to security incidents on behalf of our clients. But unlike many other APT groups, Gamma Red typically reuses domains across multiple categories or multiple campaigns. So as domains are created, they then use those in new campaigns. They also add those to a pool of domains that are rotated for future use. They also cluster their infrastructure for specific use cases. So for example, they have a download cluster and later intrusion stages such as PowerShell, Ultra VNC, and Pterandon RAT, which is a custom backdoor. They all use separate infrastructure that does not directly communicate with each other. So the point here is that they have clustering tools based on campaigns used for phishing and malware distribution. But this is only one particular group, that has been known to be targeting Ukraine based on the conflict. There's well over a dozen different types of threat groups, be it TrickBot, be it APT29, Red Delta, Sandworm, all have been known to be linked to ongoing intrusion. And some of the malware tools that have been deployed off the back of this have included everything from Conti ransomware, ICE ID, Indestroyer, PlugX, the Loic Trojan, fairly well known, Powersploit. So a lot of these are commercially available. Some of them are open source as well. So I've discussed the threats and the evolving nature of the landscape from NTT's perspective. I think cyber resilience is really a key focus area that organizations have to prioritize in order to safeguard their critical assets. Those who do will be more effective in delivering more, reliable services securely. So based on that, we have 5 strategic recommendations that organizations need to be considering. So firstly, security by design and zero trust architecture. Organizations must prepare for today's threats by adopting the likes of those zero trust architectures in order to ensure that security follows the user regardless of their device or location. So the whole concept is never trust, always verify. We know that security is a continuous process that has to be embedded into the business and organizational processes, not something that should be bolted on at the last minute. Within this presentation, I've also mentioned the use of vulnerabilities, right? Vulnerabilities are weaponized to be able to penetrate an organization or break into systems. Patch early and frequently reduces risk exposure and the window of opportunity for attackers to target assets. So again, it's something that organizations really have to be prioritizing in order to uplift their security posture. Third is continuous monitoring or threat detection and response, gaining visibility into attacks, not just targeting endpoints, but also targeting the network and of course now targeting cloud environments, where we tend to find a lot of organizations don't have visibility into the cloud. Specifically, threat detection and response capabilities minimize the scope and impact of a breach. And that's really where NTT Security Holdings specializes. Fourth, we have securing data at rest, in use, and in transit. And here it's all about securing the crown jewels. And it depends which industry you may be in. So, for example, if you're in the financial services sector, credit card data is really key. You might be in healthcare, therefore patient healthcare records are important. You might develop technology, therefore it's intellectual property or trade secrets. Whatever critical business assets or business data is, you have to encrypt it. You have to have a backup. You have to test out that backup and build controls around that data. And lastly, from a strategic recommendations perspective, reviewing business continuity and disaster recovery plans. So making sure that you have a crisis management or communications plan in place, understanding the impact of threats to your environment and how you can overcome any unplanned or unforeseen incidents should they occur. So testing out incident response plans. What I've also mentioned here in the box in blue is some of the MITRE attack mitigations. These are not just controls, technology controls, but they also factor things in like user training, because we know that controls aren't all just about technology. They also involve the user themselves. So user training, for example, you don't want people clicking on malicious attachments or malicious links. But I think based on the types of threats that we've discussed in this report, so everything from ransomware, cryptocurrency, there is different control points or ways that you can monitor for these types of threats. And I think using MITRE attack as a general framework allows you to uplift your security posture, be it updating your security software, limiting the network exposure that you have by ensuring that you have filtering and network segmentation in place, ensuring that you have operating system that's hardwired to be secure by default, and ensuring that you have the right anti-malware protection capabilities in place as well. So I think with those types of threats in mind, organizations have to remain vigilant, constantly update their threat detection and response capabilities. But really the key here is achieving cyber resilience. That really has to be the focus area for organizations to prioritize over the coming years. So that said, just a word on final thoughts. We've discussed some of the key threats, but also have a look here at just some of the challenges that will continue to play out through this year and likely into the next as well. Ransomware, again, it's always takes media headlines, but it does so for a very important purpose. It has the ability to disrupt business availability, and I think over time we'll continue to see ransomware threats evolve. Attackers are looking to reap financial profits from these types of attacks, and that creates incentives for them. And I think with ongoing geopolitical tensions, some ransomware operatives might find safe havens from which to operate. They'll continue to look for the weaker targets, but they'll also look to target the likes of critical infrastructure as well. Second, cryptocurrency. Although it was only Europe who really saw a lot of the activity there, I think over the coming years, as crypto becomes more mainstream, the likes of cryptocurrency exchanges, cross-chain bridges will really become a focal point for attacks. And this is really because cyber criminals are financially motivated, right? They're looking for the money, and there's a lot of money pouring into the cryptocurrency markets. So I expect to see a lot more infrastructure associated with those types of exchanges and bridges to be targeted over the coming years. Third, supply chain attacks, and I think last 12-18 months we've seen the success of high-profile supply chain attacks. That will continue to inspire copycat threat actors. We know they cause wide-ranging damages to both suppliers and their clients as well. And depending on the popularity of a supplier's compromised product, a supply chain can really impact tens of thousands of downstream organizations. So we've started to see that with actors targeting managed service providers, software developers as well. So this is really going to be a key piece as part of an overall security strategy, how you get visibility into third party risk. And I think this boils down to two types of threats here. So one is what we're calling incorporated threats, where attacks exploit built-in vulnerabilities. And the second is insertion threats, whereby attacks have been created by intentionally implanting malicious artifacts into software themselves. So think hijacking updates, undermining code signing, a la SolarWinds, compromising open source code. And we saw that last year, whereby there were developers who introduced vulnerabilities into the Linux kernel. And of course, if you downloaded that, then you were vulnerable. And lastly, compliance, privacy, and regulation. So I think throughout 2021, we saw a struggle in the balance between security and freedom, and between privacy versus safety. Each year we look across what's happening in different regions. We're constantly seeing updates to regulations or legislation that does impact governance risk compliance. More recently, the likes of Australia, Brazil, Japan, India, China, South Africa, US, to name a few. Many governments are renewing their focus on protecting critical infrastructure and industries associated with the vaccine cold chain. Also, more recently, we are seeing those increased regulation calls for cryptocurrency industry as well. So specifically, for example, in the US, we've seen proposed cybersecurity risk management rules and amendments for investment advisors. There's new security mandates for publicly traded companies. There's new cyber incident reporting for critical infrastructure. And even more recently, there's the SOKI Act, for example, which amends or strengthens the security and resilience of critical infrastructure by expanding the sector and asset classes that the Act applies to. So it's not just all about the energy sector or healthcare, but it does also now impact financial services, higher education, and so forth. So I think these trends are likely to continue throughout 2022 as governments continue to take more of a proactive role in ensuring the protection of critical infrastructure, of digital society, as well as people themselves. So with that said, I think we have maybe 5 minutes for questions. So Marcus, I might turn it over to you.
Yeah, so thank you, Mark, for the insights, very, very much appreciated. And if you have any questions, you can enter into the chat or just raise your voice. Meanwhile, I got a question earlier. You mentioned that we are collecting threat intelligence from our own data sources, but how do we interact with other threat intelligence and sharing communities? How are we sharing and how are we receiving threat intel from others?
So yeah, as part of NTT Security Holdings, we have various collaboration and I guess initiatives with third parties. For example, the Cyber Threat Alliance, and that's an industry alliance that is made up of about 30 different security vendors. We have automated indicator sharing in place with those, so we're consuming what other companies are providing. That provides a level of steady state protection. As part of that initiative as well, they provide disruptive capabilities. So for example, if we see something, we can always reach out, exchange intelligence, and disrupt threat actors in cyberspace. We're a part of the NCFTA, National Cyber Forensics Training Alliance. And again, this is all about sharing indicators, campaigns, new types of intelligence that may help us not only protect ourselves, but also use that intelligence to protect our clients. We're also part of FSI, Zach. We collaborate amongst different entities within NTT. So it's all about, for us, collecting that intelligence in an automated way so that it can benefit our security platform.
Thanks. And related to this, just a question here from the chat. How is the future strategy in threat intel cooperation with private and public? I think you more or less answered that question with earlier.
Yeah, exactly. So the likes of FSI, Zach, for example, or even the CTA, part of that initiative is not just to protect other security companies, but anyone who's a part or a member of those types of organizations. So if you're with the FSI's Act, for example, that would mean banks generally are a part of that, so they can use that intelligence to protect themselves. And I think even doing these types of presentations, this in itself is a threat intelligence report, and it's our way of getting it out to the broader community to let them know what the key trends are, so they can then act on that in order to improve their own security.
So we're running out of time. Thank you very much, Mark. The recording from this will be published later on the security.ntt website. We'll put some social media on LinkedIn around it as well, so you will see where it shows up. So thank you everyone for participating. And if no further questions, thank you, Mark, for your presentations and insights. And by this, we are ending this session. Thank you.